The air in the lodging house was a thick, stagnant breath, heavy with the exhalations of too many bodies in too small a space, mingled with the faint, persistent tang of old coal smoke and unwashed wool. Outside, the pre-dawn darkness of a London December still clung stubbornly to the alleyways, but within, an even deeper gloom prevailed, pierced only by the distant, sporadic coughs of sleepers stirring. Thomas, curled tight on his thin mattress on the floor, felt the familiar ache of cold seep into his bones, a constant companion since his earliest memories. His rough blanket, smelling faintly of damp and soot, offered little comfort against the pervasive chill that gnawed at his fingers and toes. He stirred, a groan catching in his throat, and pushed himself up onto an elbow. The floorboards beneath his palm were icy. Across the cramped room, the rhythmic snores of an elderly docker vied with the soft, almost imperceptible breathing of a young mother and her infant. Every sound was muted, swallowed by the closeness of the walls, the layers of grime that seemed to absorb all vibrancy. Thomas's stomach rumbled, a hollow, insistent growl that was his primary alarm clock. Another day, another scramble for coppers, another battle against the gnawing emptiness. His motivation was simple, stark: survival for himself, and perhaps a few scraps for his ailing younger sister, if he was lucky. He slipped out from under the blanket, the frigid air hitting his skin like a physical blow. Dressing in the dark was a practiced art. Coarse trousers, a thin shirt, a patched jacket that had seen too many winters. As he fumbled for his worn boots, a strange, almost imperceptible shift in the room's atmosphere caught his attention. It wasn't just the usual chill. There was a peculiar density to the air, a heavier stillness, a faint, sickly yellow glow, not quite the gray of ordinary mist, bled from beneath the ill-fitting door, hinting at something unnatural beyond. The customary rumble and distant shouts of the earliest risers in the streets outside were strangely absent, replaced by an unnerving, profound quiet. He knelt, peering at the sliver of light beneath the door. The air filtering in smelled different today, sharper, with an acrid, metallic tang that prickled the back of his throat. This was not merely the common London fog, the familiar London particular that swirled in from the Thames, blanketing the city in a damp, ethereal gray. Those fogs were a nuisance, yes, a curtain that veiled the gas lights and slicked the cobblestones, but they were a part of the city's breath, almost predictable. This felt heavier, more suffocating. This had the unsettling density of a Pea Souper, one of the infamous killer fogs that seemed to descend like a malevolent spirit, not just obscuring vision, but tasting of fire and brimstone. These were the true urban monsters, born from the countless domestic fires burning soft, cheap coal in every hearth, from the belching chimneys of factories, breweries, and gasworks, all trapped by temperature inversions and an unforgiving atmosphere. The city was choking on its own progress, and it was brewing a truly terrible storm outside Thomas's door. He pushed the door open, just a crack, and was met by a wall of impenetrable ochre-colored gloom. It wasn't just dark, it was solid. The air that seeped in was thick, cloying, already scratching at his lungs. The familiar street, his daily battleground, had vanished, swallowed whole by this viscous, silent shroud. The deepening fog makes the familiar street an alien, dangerous place. How will Thomas even begin his daily struggle for survival in this suffocating labyrinth? He stepped out, fully now, into a world that had ceased to exist. The air was a physical presence, a cold, wet blanket that clung to his face, stinging his eyes and immediately scratching at the back of his throat. This wasn't just poor visibility. It was an absolute, suffocating void. His outstretched hand, a mere foot from his face, was a blurred, indistinct shape swallowed by the ochre gloom. The gaslight at the corner, usually a beacon, was reduced to a halo of sickly yellow, dissolving into nothingness after a few yards. The silence was unnatural, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the drip of moisture from unseen eaves and the distant, distorted echoes of the city's usual clamor. A muffled shout, an urgent, unseen cough, the clatter of hooves growing momentarily louder before fading into the haze. Each sound was an isolated, terrifying event, its source unknown.
Every shadow could conceal a threat, every unseen movement a potential collision. The taste of the air was metallic, acrid, like licking cold iron mixed with the fumes of 1,000 burning sulfur matches, coating his tongue and catching in his lungs. His usual route, etched into his young mind by countless journeys, was now useless. The familiar landmarks, the chipped brick of the baker's wall, the uneven rise of a specific flagstone, the iron railing of Mrs. Gable's house, were all gone. He pressed a hand against the cold, damp bricks of the alleyway, trying to guide himself, his fingers seeking the familiar rough texture of worn stone, the slickness of wet soot. A wave of panic, sharp and cold, threatened to overwhelm him. He was lost, not in some faraway wilderness, but just outside his own door, in the very city he called home. He took a few hesitant steps, each one a gamble, his small package of cheap penny matches clutched tightly in his other hand. Who would buy matches today? Who would even see him? Traffic, the lifeblood of London, had ceased. The rumble of omnibuses, the clatter of hansoms, the endless stream of drays and carts, all had ground to a halt. Horses, usually a menacing rush, now stood tethered, or moved at a snail's pace, their breath pluming white and heavy. Accidents were inevitable, unseen collisions in the murk, leaving hidden snarls of broken wood and panicked animals. Even the mighty Thames was paralyzed. The shouts of lightermen and the mournful calls of foghorns were muted, echoing across a river that had become a blind, churning oblivion. For a boy like Thomas, dependent on movement, on visibility, on the city's ceaseless momentum, This stasis was not just an inconvenience, but a threat to his very survival. To be out here was to be vulnerable, a ghost amidst ghosts, and the fear of a snatch, a bump, a fall, or simply being separated from his meager wares gnawed at him. The physical journey is hard enough, but the fog isn't just a physical barrier. It's a poison. How long can anyone breathe this air before it takes hold? The fog was not merely a physical wall, a suffocating blanket that swallowed the gaslight and the cries of the living. It was a poison, drawn into the very core of one's being with every ragged breath. For Thomas, the shift from disorientation to physical agony was swift and brutal. His throat, raw and burning, felt scoured by grit. Each inhale a shallow, desperate rasp against protesting lungs that ached with a dull, persistent throb. Involuntary coughs ripped through him, dry and painful, tearing at his chest until he felt an unbearable tightness, as if an invisible hand was squeezing the life out of him. Breathing became a conscious, laborious act, a battle for every wisp of tainted air. He wasn't alone in this torment. Through the murk, Thomas saw others, shadowy figures hunched over, their faces streaked with soot and despair, their own chests heaving. The elderly, already frail, seemed to struggle most profoundly, their wheezing coughs a constant, mournful chorus in the oppressive silence. Even the younger ones, like himself, moved with a slowness that spoke of deep, creeping exhaustion. Their shoulders slumped under an invisible weight. The air was thick with the sound of collective suffering, a cacophony of hacking and gasping that echoed the city's own slow, choking demise. Fear, a cold, cloying thing, began to mix with the metallic taste in his mouth. It was a fear not just of getting lost or being robbed, but of this unseen assailant invading his very body, stealing his strength, making him weak and vulnerable. A sense of hopelessness crept in, the world closing tighter and tighter, offering no escape, no horizon, just an endless, acrid gray. He longed for even a moment's respite, a pocket of air that didn't feel like drawing liquid smoke into his lungs. He stumbled towards the faint, orange glow of a gaslight spilling from a pub doorway, seeking temporary refuge in its slightly less toxic embrace. For a few precious moments, standing in the relative warmth, the air felt marginally thinner, a temporary reprieve before he had to plunge back into the impenetrable wall. Yet, even this small comfort highlighted the stark division of the city. For those in grander homes, the fog was a nuisance, perhaps a morbid curiosity. Servants, often just as exposed as Thomas, would fetch their supplies, their roaring fireplaces, burning the same coal that fueled this very smog, keeping them warm and dry, albeit contributing to the city's collective illness. But for Thomas and the countless others like him, living on the streets or in unheated tenements, there was no escape. They were utterly exposed, breathing in air laden with sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, and countless particles of soot and industrial waste. The city's poisoned breath,
corrosive to lung and spirit alike.
This air, a deadly cocktail of industrial output and domestic hearth, settled deep in the lungs, coating the delicate tissues, igniting inflammation, and making the simplest act of respiration an agonizing struggle. It was a silent, invisible killer, creeping into every alley and every body, a stark reminder of the hidden costs of Victorian progress. The fog isolates and poisons, but it also creates opportunities for those who prey on vulnerability. How does crime flourish in this shroud? And what new dangers does it present to someone like Thomas? The city's poisoned breath, corrosive to lung and spirit alike, did more than just sicken. It twisted the very fabric of urban life, transforming familiar streets into a vast, unlit stage for desperation. In this suffocating shroud, where visibility ceased to exist beyond an arm's length, the fog did not merely isolate, it emboldened. It offered an unparalleled cloak for those who preyed on vulnerability, turning the everyday struggle for survival into a high-stakes gamble with unseen enemies. From the formless gloom, new sounds began to emerge, distinct from the usual muffled cacophony. There were hurried, scuffling footsteps that seemed to materialize from nowhere and vanish just as quickly. The sudden, sharp smash of glass from a distant shop front, followed by a frantic scurry. Muffled shouts, quickly silenced, dissolving back into the oppressive quiet. These were the sounds of opportunity, seized by the desperate and the opportunistic, using the fog as a perfect accomplice. Pickpockets moved with audacious stealth, their hands deft and unseen. Burglars found cover even in broad day. And worse, figures dissolved into the haze with terrifying ease.
Thomas, clutching his meager earnings and the few damp wares he still hoped to sell, walked with a constant, desperate vigilance. His head swiveled, not truly seeing, but straining to hear, to sense the slightest shift in the air, the softest tread of another soul too close. Every dark alley mouth, every deeper shadow cast by an unseen building, became a potential trap. His heart pounded a restless rhythm against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear. He'd learned to flatten himself against cold brick walls when he heard footsteps approaching, holding his breath, hoping to be overlooked, another insignificant shadow swallowed by the gloom.
Once, a figure had brushed past him so close, a phantom touch, that Thomas felt the empty space where his pocket had been only a moment before. He'd cried out, a thin, reedy sound lost in the thick air, his hand instinctively fumbling. Too late. The shadowy form had already melted away, a whisper into the yellow-gray, leaving him trembling, his throat raw from the scream that died unheard.
Later, pressed against the doorway of a closed butcher's, he watched, or rather perceived, the shadowy ballet of two figures wrestling over a bundle, their grunts and struggles choked by the air, before one melted away, leaving the other whimpering on the invisible pavement. The flickering gas lights, usually a meager comfort, now seemed to mock him. Their halos were pathetic,
barely pushing back the gloom, distorting forms into grotesque, dancing shadows that could be anything or nothing. A guide, yes, but also a deceptive lure, drawing the eye towards eerie, shifting illusions.
In this sensory deprivation, even Thomas felt the insidious whisper of desperation. He imagined the feel of another man's coin purse, the brief surge of warmth from a pilfered loaf of bread. The hunger gnawed, the cold bit, and the city's unseen predators made him question his own dwindling moral fortitude. He saw it in the eyes of others, too. Gaunt faces, wild with fear and hunger, looking at each other not with camaraderie, but with suspicion, and sometimes a terrifying spark of avarice.
During these great smogs, the official records, though often incomplete, would later tell a grim story of soaring crime rates. The very conditions that choked the city's lungs also offered perfect anonymity to its underbelly. The bobbies, those stalwart figures of Victorian order, found their effectiveness severely curtailed. A whistle blast carried only a few feet. A pursuit was impossible beyond a few desperate strides into the impenetrable haze. Law and order, like so much else, became just another casualty of the suffocating, insidious fog.
As the days dragged on, the sheer physical and mental toll of the smog became almost unbearable. What happens when hope dwindles and the city itself seems to be dying? The Pea Souper did not lift. The days, already indistinguishable in their suffocating murk, bled into one another, each dawn revealing only a denser, more oppressive gray-yellow nightmare. The city's pulse, already erratic, now stuttered, then almost ceased. Shops remained shuttered, their windows streaked with oily grime. The clatter of deliveries, the distant hum of industry, the vibrant cacophony of London life, all fell silent. Schools, once teeming with children, stood empty, spectral in the haze. The very rhythm of the metropolis, once unstoppable, had been violently disrupted, replaced by a morbid, hushed stillness, broken only by the incessant, wet cough of the suffering. For Thomas, each sunrise brought not renewed hope, but a deeper plunge into despair. His relentless cough, once a mere irritation, now racked his small frame, leaving his chest aching and raw. Exhaustion was a constant companion, a heavy cloak that clung to him, stealing his strength. His few coppers had long since been spent on stale crusts that offered little sustenance, and now even cheap food was scarce. The few street vendors brave enough to venture out found no buyers, their wares coated in a fine black film. His work, his very reason for being in the streets, became an impossible fiction. Who needed an errand boy when no one could see to give an errand, and nothing was moving anyway? The city's services, the skeletal structure holding Victorian London together, buckled under the strain. Hospitals, already stretched thin, were overwhelmed. Every ward, every corridor, Every available space groaned with the afflicted. Men, women, and children gasping for air, their faces blue-tinged and clammy. The morgues, usually grim but orderly, now spilled their tragic contents into hallways, the dead accumulating faster than they could be processed or identified. The muffled, somber processions of burial carts, once infrequent, became an almost continuous dirge, struggling to move through the blinding fog, their drivers barely able to see the horses' heads, let alone the way.
To transport the sick or the dead was a Sisyphean task, a final desperate struggle against an invisible enemy that continued its silent, relentless culling. The air itself remained a constant, sickening presence, its pervasive smell, a vile cocktail of sulfur, burnt coal, and damp earth, seeped into every pore, every fiber of clothing, every memory. Everything was coated in a greasy, black grime that could not be washed away. The raw, aching cold of the fog seemed to penetrate to the very bone, no amount of worn wool or thin shelter enough to ward it off.
And always, always the constant, conscious effort of breathing, each shallow inhale a painful victory, each exhale a rasping reminder of the city's slow, agonizing death. Historically, these killer fogs were not just an inconvenience, they were mass casualty events. Records from the Great Smog of 1873, and later, even more devastatingly, 1952, show spikes in deaths numbering in the thousands, predominantly from respiratory illnesses. The strain on medical and funeral services was catastrophic, a stark and undeniable testament to the fatal embrace of industrial progress.
Just as hope seems to vanish, a subtle shift in the air might signal an end. What is the immediate aftermath of such a catastrophe, and what lessons were, or weren't, learned? After what felt like an eternity of suffocating gray, a flicker. It was so subtle at first, Thomas almost dismissed it as a trick of his aching eyes, another cruel phantom born of his fevered exhaustion. But then, a faint, almost imperceptible lightning in the oppressive pall overhead. A breath of wind, not the usual damp chill, but one that seemed to carry a hint of something clean, something beyond the omnipresent stench of sulfur and soot.
Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the solid wall of yellow-black began to fracture, like a stage curtain drawn back on a city forgotten. London began to unveil itself, grimy and scarred, but undeniably there. The relief that washed over Thomas was physical, a shuddering release of tension he hadn't realized had coiled so tightly within him. Yet it was a relief tangled with profound weariness. His lungs still burned, his cough still tore at his chest, and a deep, bone-aching fatigue threatened to drag him back into the shadows. He saw others emerging too, faces pale and drawn, movements stiff and uncertain, like figures newly awakened from a long, troubled sleep. But the lifting fog also revealed the true, devastating toll. Ambulances, now visible, clattered through the streets, their drivers urgent, their purpose grim. Covered carts, hastily repurposed, made slow, heavy progress, gathering the bodies that had been hidden by the haze. The old, the infirm, the infants, the countless victims whose last breath had been stolen by the city's polluted air. Hospitals, once shrouded in the impenetrable gloom, now stood starkly revealed, their doors constantly swinging open for the endless stream of the sick. The stench of illness, of death, was clearer now, mingling with the lingering acridity of the smog itself. The sheer scale of the tragedy was laid bare, a silent testament to the invisible enemy that had stalked the streets. For Thomas, the immediate aftermath was a slow, painful climb back to survival. Could he resume his work? The streets, though clearer, felt alien, still echoing with the phantom fears of the past week.
His small supply of goods had long since gone or spoiled. But hunger, that most enduring and unforgiving master, would not wait. He had to begin again, his body heavy, his cough constant, his spirit burdened by the countless faces of suffering he had witnessed. This experience, etched into his very being, would remain a stark, enduring memory. It was a lesson in the city's power, its beauty, and its terrible capacity for neglect. In the wake of such catastrophic events, public outcry inevitably followed. Demands for action, for change, voices rose, advocating for reform, for controls on the burning of coal, for cleaner air. These calls would eventually lead, decades later, to legislation like the Clean Air Acts of the mid-20th century. But for Victorian London, change was agonizingly slow. The engines of industry, fueled by coal, were too deeply embedded in the nation's wealth and identity. The hidden cost of progress, the health, the lives, the suffering of the urban poor, was a price too often ignored or deemed unavoidable.
The Great Smog was a brutal, undeniable exposure of this vulnerability, a stark reminder of how those with the least were always the first and worst to suffer the consequences of industrial ambition. The city, resilient in its grime and its misery, endured, but its lessons echoed through time, a silent warning etched into the very stones of London.